On stage, please. A big round of applause for both of them.
I've learned a lot about your collection, about the kind of philanthropic work that you do, and I have to say I'm so inspired. Philanthropy is a new emergent conversation in India, and I wish Kiran could have joined us today because she has really spearheaded the KNMA, and we don't really have that much philanthropy in the arts. There is philanthropy, like I explained, in grassroots social movements, education, poverty alleviation, but not necessarily in culture. And culture is a very important conversation to have in the global south. So I thought today we would talk about, the new emergent Western gaze over South Asian art or the global south. And you can tell us a little bit about your philanthropic journey. I found out just a little while back that you and me both worked and started our careers in the same company, KPMG, which is a big surprise. And I asked you the same question that everyone asks me, which I find very annoying. And so I don't really know why I asked you that question, which is how do you balance your corporate life and your philanthropic sort of intentionalities and your journey? But of course, we all have multiple selves and we're not in an age anymore where we have to choose one or the other. So having said that, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started collecting art? Because I know you wanted to be an actor, right? So tell us a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for being here, and by all means ask questions as we go, and there's nothing off limits. I grew up in England in a modest, lower middle class environment. Both my parents worked, and they felt the most important thing that they could give my brother and I was an education. And so they sacrificed everything they could to send us to boarding school. There was no art at home and no cultural engagement at home. And I went to boarding school when I was 7, which was very young to go to boarding school. And when I got to high school, I was also at boarding school, and I was the youngest in my year, and there was no room in the school for me. So I was billeted at the home of the head of the art department. And I had no art education. I just happened to be sent to live in the home of the head of the art department. And as a consequence, he opened my eyes to art, and he's still living, he's still making art. He's in his 90s, and he was my inspiration. And school holidays, as I mentioned, both my parents were working, so I would wander around the museums and galleries in London and look at things. And one day I was in the Royal Academy. They were having a summer show. The Royal Academy Summer Show is a selling exhibition. And there was a work there that really did something for me. It sort of struck me in my heart. The thing that struck me was the image versus the title. The title didn't seem to relate to the image. But it was so moving that I bought the work. It was £50. I was 17, and I wrote to the artist. And I asked the artist to explain the work to me. And she wrote back. And the letter that she wrote me, I pasted on the back of the frame. And that picture still sits on my desk in my office. And that was the beginning of my journey. It started off as an interest, it became a passion, and as all passions do, they became an obsession. And over the last 50 years, I've continued to collect work from all over the world, never sold the work, often gifted works to museums, And that's really been our journey. And in every case, when we've bought a work, I've been married 37 years, and since I've been married, we've bought together. When I bought a work, the only criteria is it has to strike us and cause an emotional impact. Often people have said, why haven't you got a work by X or Y? And we may admire those artists, but if the work doesn't impact us profoundly, doesn't mean we don't admire it, but it's not something we want to live with. And so over the last 50 years, we've built a very significant collection of art from all over the world, and have met pretty much every artist that we've collected. For me, being surrounded by creative people is what drives me. My business is creative, but my other life, as Myna talks about, is also very creative. And so being with creative people, meeting the artists tonight, that's what life is all about for us.
That's amazing. Simon, you know, your patronage for institutions is so well known. I mean, you're a permanent board member of I don't know how many museums, etc. How do you think this patronage for museums or institutions has changed over the years? And what do you see yourself, your role as one of the patron members, and how should it change further?
So I first got involved with the governance of institutions probably 30 years ago, and I was asked to get involved given my professional career as an advisor. So my journey didn't start as a philanthropist. My journey started as a board member who brought some intellectual skills and value to the board, and I quickly realized that another role that a board member can provide where they have it is financial support. And so we started to narrow those places we gave to those places we were involved with. And we could therefore give more meaningfully and become more deeply engaged. And the culture of philanthropy really started in North America, as many of you would know, where the government has never been involved in supporting the creative industries. So it depended on people with means to be able to support the arts and performing arts. And the UK had a strong government base, as did many parts of Europe. The Australian model was a bit more of a hybrid, where the government gave towards operating costs, but didn't give towards collections or commissions. And so we got involved. We have realized that you're on the planet for a short period of time. And whether you have financial means or volunteering skills, each of us can make a difference. And both my wife and I feel very passionately that we want to leave the planet in a better place than what we found it. You can't take it with you. We came into the world with nothing. I inherited a set of cufflinks when my father passed. We don't believe in inheritance. I've done well professionally, and I want to make a difference in areas that I'm passionate about, or areas that my wife is passionate about, and they inevitably are the arts and human rights. And we live in a very difficult world, and where we can make a difference both intellectually and financially, and ideally encourage people we know and respect to do the same, we feel very blessed that we've had that opportunity, and I've learned a huge amount. I've met some amazing people, and it's enriched my life.
Yeah, no, it's completely true. I mean, we always talk about static culture, and we talk about, oppressive culture sometimes, but really the only culture that can be changed is through culture. So you have to replace culture with a new culture.
And in many ways, that's why those communities were broken communities, because their culture was not respected and celebrated. And that really troubled me, because I thought it was art. I'm not a curator. I'm a collector, and I love being around creative people. But I couldn't understand why these most important art makers were lost and forgotten. So I started to have conversations. I started the conversations overseas because I recognized that having the conversation in Australia was hopeless. Australia had already decided that these people were not artists and they should be in storerooms and archives. So I started to talk to museum directors around the world. The first director I spoke to ran one of the largest museums in the world. And I said to him, why don't you have any indigenous art in your collection? I wasn't referring to Australians specifically. I was interested why he didn't have any Native American art in the collection, why he didn't have any Inuit art in the collection. And he said something to me that deeply disturbed me. His response was, I don't know how to look at it. Exact words. I said to him, you know how to look at Van Gogh's work? You study Van Gogh, you read the letters, you read the literature. Why can't you look at Indigenous art and learn about Indigenous art? He said it belongs in the Natural History Museum. It's not art. That comment was 20 years ago. How museum culture has changed for the good, and something we can all celebrate. This year's the 25th anniversary of the Tate in London. Their key show this year will be by Emily Kangwari, an Indigenous artist from Australia, where the curators have realized that First Nations art is the beginning of art and needs to be celebrated, and modern art takes its learnings from this art that was made 60,000 years ago. So the museum director 20 years ago has learned. The same person is begging me to gift our Indigenous art to his museum today. I have to say it's more likely to go to the Tate than it is to his collection. But we all need to celebrate our First Nations artists, our Indigenous artists in India. I saw some work today at the National Craft Museum. It's extraordinary work, and we don't celebrate it in the same way as we celebrate modern painters, and we should.
What do you have to say about political art?
Well, for me...
Recently I read that article that you sent to me, and I know there was a huge brouhaha about it, and I know that the contemporary art world both embraces but at the same time shies away from the politics of contemporary issues that surround us. So how do you feel about, and I know that you said earlier that you like art and you collect art that does something to your heart and hits you. So have you ever felt that you were taking a risk? And I know that you have political work in your collection. So tell us a little bit about that, because that's such an important conversation for this country to have as well.
Yes, for us, art that is made in places going through change and turmoil is much more interesting than art that is made in places that are benign and having a pretty easy time. So we particularly are interested in looking at art in places that are going through great change or turmoil, and far less interested in looking at art from places that are having an easy time, because art tells you a story. It tells you about what's happening now, and that's the type of art that strikes a chord. I'm very concerned that politics is moving to the extreme, and as a consequence, artists are fearing. They're fearing for their livelihood, they're fearing for their opportunity. You've probably seen what's happened in America in the last week with Trump cancelling a lot of art museum funding and work. I think 26,000 museum workers are about to be laid off in America.
Oh my God.
So the politics is a real issue. Myna referred to a situation in Australia around the selection of the artists for the Venice Biennale. I've been involved in Venice for 30 years. The Biennale is a very important Biennale because it has national pavilions. So each country, other than India, which doesn't have representation, each country is able to present an artist that they consider is making a statement about today. And so last year, the Australian Pavilion won the Golden Lion, the first time it's ever won the Golden Lion for the best pavilion. It was a very political work by an Indigenous artist about Indigenous death in custody, which is a very challenging situation in Australia where many young Indigenous people are dying in prison. And that work spoke about a very important issue, and the Venetian judges deemed it to be the best work in Venice last year. So all eyes were on Australia's selection for next year, and the Australian arts-funded body selected a Lebanese refugee artist who is a Sufi man, talking about the importance of peace. And the selection was applauded globally. 6 days later, a question was asked in Parliament about the selection of the artist. A phone call occurred between the Minister of the Arts and the Director of the Arts funding body. An emergency board meeting was called. Within 45 minutes, the commission was rescinded, with no discussion with the artist at all and no reason given. What appears to have happened is that the opposition Minister of Arts asked a question in Parliament about a work that this artist made 20 years ago. Completely different time, completely different work. The Arts Minister was not briefed, couldn't answer the question. All of a sudden, there were suggestions that this artist was racist, which he's not, and turmoil ensued. Australia is now the laughingstock of the global arts community, having commissioned a great artist and withdrawn the commission within 6 days. This cancel culture, which we're experiencing, is not just in Australia. It's happening all over the world. I've heard today about some of the issues here in India. It is greatly concerning to me how artists are being picked on, how they're feeling uncomfortable about being able to make their work, how they're being challenged as to whether their work can be seen. This particular artist in Australia has had shows cancelled. As a consequence, his livelihood is being jeopardized. You can imagine his anguish and all the issues having been celebrated one moment and 6 days later having it withdrawn. Political interference in the arts is only going to get greater, and we need to stand up to it, and we need to be willing to speak about it, and it's not acceptable.
Yeah. Well, people like you will do a lot for standing up for something like that. I think, what about biennales? I mean, how do you think, what can change in biennales? Do you think there are barriers to access to biennales? Even though, if you look philanthropically, I mean, biennales have kind of led curatorial sort of progression in inclusivity and changing some of the conversations around contemporary art.
I mean, the most important thing with a biennale is the selection of the artistic director or curator, and to select a brave curator who is prepared to challenge and bring these issues of today to the fore is really important, and we need to encourage that. There are a lot more biennales. Every few months there seems to be a new biennale, but they are incredibly important places. They're important places for artists. They're great places for artists to be seen, and they should be celebrated. And it starts with the selection of the curator and the willingness and the bravery of the artists who participate.
You know, in South Asia or the global South, I mean, we have a long history of magnificent work, long histories of craft, of skill, of, iconic sort of lineages of traditions of work. But what do you do with all that work if you can't show it? You know, how does one start to bridge that gap? You know, this is really a question that, I mean, I know that you faced also in Australia. Like, how do you get the wider world to see? Because the truth is that, you know, I've been in this country now for 10 years, living here, but I was in the US for 25 years. And for me, it's deeply personal, the way South Asian art is seen, and and the context with which it is seen, and the nuances or the layering or the complexity is not diluted. We don't want to be included as just just as a diversity sort of tokenization any longer. At the same time, we don't want to lose your identity. We do want to be seen as South Asian artists or curators, or it has to be South Asian. So how do you bridge that? How does one, you being at the helm of so many institutions in the West, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I spent many years being challenged by that issue. And initially I thought the answer was to take artists to those institutions. But I realized that wasn't the answer. And I found that the better answer was to bring the institutions to the artist. It's very easy if you're a curator in London to go to Paris. If you're a curator in New York, to go to LA or to go to Basel. But to think about coming to India or to Singapore or to Hong Kong or even to Australia was never on your radar. It wasn't considered fun. Your friends weren't there, and you didn't know what you were going to experience. But my greatest successes have been in bringing curators from those institutions that don't understand the Greater South, don't understand the diversity of practice, bringing them out into your community, bringing them to artist studios, bringing them to fellow institutions, and seeing the diversity of collection. And we championed in Australia a partnership with the Tate. I found a major corporation, Qantas Airways, who gave $5 million, and we started a joint collection. So the Museum of Contemporary Art and the Tate would buy Australian art and integrate it into the Tate collection. And every year the Tate curators would come to Australia, They would, and together they would identify work that they wanted to buy jointly. And you don't see it as Australian art in the Tate collection. You see it as art that the Tate has acquired. I don't look at gender or age or ethnic origin. I look at the art, and it either strikes me or it doesn't. And I didn't want to see a little Australian flag against a picture in the Tate. I wanted Australian artists to feel like they were Tate collection artists. And the way we did that was to bring the curators down and immerse them in Australian art. And I would encourage those of us working in the South to find relationships that we can do the same, to bring curators regularly down to do studio visits, to visit institutions. It's very different. It's not like going to Paris or Basel, but it's far more interesting. They'll learn a lot, and they will feel that their collections are deficient of a great practice that is occurring in this part of the world. So anything we can do to bring global curators into our communities, I would encourage is the answer.
That's such a fantastic, that's exactly what I did, right? Like, pushed you for 5 years to come here. No, it's so important. It's true, because the burden of taking works to the West cannot fall on the global South, because just creating work and creating without hesitation and being true to intentional practice is such an enormous effort in the global South already. And so many artists are doing that.
There's no context. If you take an Indian artist to London, the curator might meet them and they might engage with them, but they don't have the context of the practice. If you bring the curator here, they can see 40 or 50 artists go and engage in the community. It's far more effective.
So one of my favorite museums is by far the MoMA and the PS1. So tell us a little bit about your engagement with PS1 now that they've just announced you as sort of like the strategic leadership. And I just recently saw 2 shows of diaspora artists from South Asia. That was so exciting to see. Tell us a little bit more about what's in the future for PS1 and how it's different from the MoMA as well.
Yeah, so PS1's been going almost 50 years. It was an independent institution. MoMA recognized that they weren't engaging with that community of experimental artists, and they formed an association, and we're actually a subsidiary, an independent subsidiary of MoMA with our own board and governance, and we independently fund as well. So we're really the experimental part of a massive, big institution. MoMA is in the process of appointing a new director. Glenn Larry is retiring after 30 years. PS1 has just appointed a new director, a lady called Connie Butler, who came from Hammer in Los Angeles. And we've just gone through a strategic rethink as to what is important to PS1, how we build on that very important relationship with MoMA and MoMA audience, but how we also maintain our differentiated position. And for an institution like PS1, we're a very artist-centric institution. So being relevant to the artist is our number one priority. Being relevant to the community in which we sit in, particularly after COVID, where communities have been broken, being very relevant to that community and putting on shows that are internationally relevant, like Rick Ritt's recent show, are also very important. So we've had a unique opportunity to sort of recalibrate what we are and what we want to be as we move into our 50th year. And being a corporate advisor by profession, that's the type of work I love engaging with, and it's a terrific team at PS1, and I'm really excited about the future ahead. I also sit on the MoMA International Council, and I'm also on the MoMA New Media Committee. I'm a large collector of moving image, and the New Media Committee is responsible for MoMA's moving image collection, so I'm enjoying that as well.
That's so exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about the composition of curators? Because I know, is that something that strikes you? I mean, this is my observation also, is that I think what you suggested is absolutely tremendous. I think definitely curators should come to the Global South if they want to program the Global South. But as a first step, while that's happening, has it ever occurred to institutions to kind of change composition? Is that something that's on the radar, where they look at having culturally specific sort of curators curate work from those regions?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I've always thought the role of the board is not to get involved in curatorial matters, so I've been very careful not to delve into the curatorial business, because you have a director whose job it is to do that stuff, and you either trust them to do that job well, or you change them if they're not doing the job well. So I've always been very careful not to get involved in the curatorial side, but to back curators that I admire and love, and give them every bit of support that I can when they're looking at projects. I've found institutions are increasingly appointing specialist curators. So we had a conversation about First Nations art. A lot of institutions are now appointing First Nations curators, which I think is fantastic, because it's embedding First Nations into the DNA of the institution. Increasingly, larger institutions are appointing Global South curators, so people who have come from the Global South or who have worked in the Global South. So I think institutions are changing, but these are large institutions. They have funding challenges, so making a new appointment needs to be funded, it takes time. But I think institutions are waking up that their collections are not representative of what their audience wants to see. So 40 or 50 years ago, if you were a woman artist, you wouldn't be seen in a national collection. Maybe 10% of the collection was female artists, and 50% of the audience were women. Now, with low-cost air travel, you're seeing thousands of people from the Global South visiting the North and going to museums and not seeing any art from their countries, not seeing how their art practices integrate with art practices from everywhere else. So the audience experience has to change, because the audience is now global. The audience isn't just from the town that the institution is in, and museum practice has to change, because if you want to attract a younger audience, and most institutions want to attract Gen Z audience, they don't want to go and see a static picture. They find it boring, or they will go in and Instagram it but not look at it. So I think museum practice is going to have to change pretty dramatically if museums are going to remain relevant to the next generation of audience as well. So I think running a museum has enormous challenges on how you adapt to the issues of today. You have an unrepresentative collection. You have an audience that's demanding more to remain engaged, and you don't have enough funding. So the the challenges of those of you in the audience, the museum directors, I admire and wish to support.
This is absolutely true because, like I said, I mean, on one hand, you want, like you said, First Nations art to just be art that the Tate has collected. The more specific something is, I truly believe the more universal it becomes, right? And I went to the SFO MoMA recently. New York is a little different. I've grown up around the PS1, and so I've seen engagement. I've worked with people like Amir Parsa in the Public Education Department of MoMA. I've seen them reach out to diaspora. But I found that the SFO MoMA had absolutely very little, and that's why I wanted someone from, from India's sort of major museums as well, to start this conversation about how do you exchange, because as South Asians, we have a long history and tradition, but we also have a history of being colonized, and yet we are right now in this vortex of globalization, right? We are everywhere. SFO especially, the West Coast especially, museums would have so much more engagement with diasporic communities, for example, if there was some representation of themselves that they saw in the arts and culture around. And I think that's very important for museums also to grow their audiences, especially in places like SFO and New York. New York is always very special and has always embraced diversity on a very different level. Tell us about your collection, like more about your collection and what have you collected from the Global South? A little bit about, I know you were an early collector of Anish, and who else? And Gauri, I know, is in your collection.
So as I mentioned, we've never looked at gender or ethnicity or geography when we've gone about buying a work of art. So 8 or 9 years ago, our insurance company said to us, your collection is now so large that we need to have it documented. We're happy to continue to insure it, but we need to have it documented. And so we said, how do we go about doing that? We've got files of catalogs and receipts when we bought something, but what do you mean by documented? And they said, it needs to be properly archived. And we still didn't really understand what they were saying, and eventually we worked out that they wanted someone to properly document the whole collection. So we finally decided to recruit the former head of Christie's in Australia to do it for us, and it took her 5 years. And at the end of 5 years, she came to my wife and I and said, would you be interested in my observations? And we both said, no, not really. These are things that we've bought, that we love. We're not curators. Every piece has meant something to us at the time that we bought it. But if you have some observations, by all means tell us, but it's not going to really impact us at all. So we asked around for dinner, and the first thing she said to us was, 90% of your collection is female artists. Well, A, I didn't know that, and B, I didn't know why that was important. And she then explained to us that museum collections were 90% male artists and 10% women, and how unusual it was to her as a curator to see a collection that was predominantly women artists, but we'd never thought about that. Secondly, she said, you've got an extraordinary moving image collection. She said, I've never seen a moving image collection as diverse as yours in any public institution, let alone in a private collection. And she said, why have you collected moving image? And I said, I spend 300 days of the year in a hotel and 60 days of the year at home, and I can put in my bag 4 or 5 DVDs of moving image artwork, and I can play it on hotel screens in my room,
Fantastic.
rather than watching CNN, and that's fantastic. And she said, well, I've never seen anything like that before, so I always carry some DVDs in my bag. And the other thing she said was, you've got art from pretty much every country in the world. And I said, well, I travel a lot and I do see interesting things, but again, I've never thought about it. But we do have a lot of art from India, and interestingly, the last time I was in India was 48 years ago, and I wasn't collecting art 48 years ago. So we've seen Indian art outside of India, not as Indian art, but just as great art. And I met Myna in Turin, as we mentioned, and we saw some art there that we thought was fantastic, which we were able to buy, including Punit's work, who's here. I saw Gary Gill in a documentary. I think it was her first international show, maybe 15 years ago. And we've got a massive collection of Gary's work. I'm actually going to see her on Monday for dinner. We have a lot of Indian artists, Bangladeshi artists, Pakistani artists, Nepalese artists, but we've never thought of them as artists from those countries. They just make great work that said something to us at the time, and when it came to documenting it, we then discovered where they came from. But I also find it challenging when people ask about geography, because where you're born, does that dictate that you're Indian because you were born in India? Or, there are Indian heritage artists in Australia making great work. Are they Indian or are they Australian? So I think it's quite a challenging question. At the end of the day, if you're making great art and it says something to us, that's far more important than whether you're male, female, homosexual, heterosexual, Indian, Pakistani, or Australian.
That's wonderful to know. But I can make a prediction. I can make a prediction that 10 years from now, when you're the next head of Christie's or Sotheby's looks at your collection, they're going to find a much higher percentage of Indian artists in your collection.
Well, I have started today to make a shopping list of things I want to talk to you about.
That's wonderful. That's always very good news. Talking about moving, and what you just said was very moving. I always say this is that for a lot of us today, that divide between the East and the West really does not exist anymore. Or it exists, but we are sort of in this displaced space, because I know that when I go to the West, and I do need to go there from time to time, otherwise I think I'd go crazy if I didn't move or if I didn't travel. I have a sense of displacement when I'm there, and I have a sense of displacement here because I don't really fit in very well. But that sense of displacement now has become home, and I know that that's true for you as well. And yet sometimes one can't help but feel a sense of nostalgia for another home or something that we carry in our hearts. And just on that level, our next, this is a good time for us to break. There's so much more to talk about, but thank you, Simon, for having this conversation with us. And I'm very proud to, announce that the next thing that we'll have on stage today is the Nityagram Dance Ensemble. This is a company that I have grown up with in New York, and it has changed the landscape of culture in New York. I remember one of the first shows that I had gone to, and I started a feminist dance theater company, which was surprisingly the first. It was just very randomly, I was at the right place at the right time, and We were embraced by New York as the first brown dance theatre company. Never saw the kind of, never imagined the kind of success that we did. But Nityagram was, I remember going to one of their first concerts, and there were 10 people in the audience at the St. Mark's Theatre. Lynn, are you around? That's the director of the Nityagram Dance Ensemble. And from there, it has become today in New York one of the most hotly anticipated dance companies. The Joyce, the New York Times, New Yorker have referred to them as one of the most luminous, one of the best 3 years in a row. I'm so proud that they are here today, and they're doing an intersectional work that speaks very much to the concept of the exhibition, about travel, about migration, about home, about something lost, something held on to. I wanted to talk a lot more about Nityagram. It's a dance village. If you guys don't know it, you should definitely know about it. It truly is India's shining example of culture, heritage, and contemporariness. I'm going to let Shurupa Sen, the choreographer and the artistic director, talk more about this particular work. But ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat, and I'm so proud to announce the next